welcome to the Winning Mentality podcast, the show getting the stories behind sporting success. I'm Charlie Bosco, and today I'm chatting to Patrick McKeown of the Oxygen Advantage. Now, I have to admit that when I started researching Patrick and the Oxygen Advantage method, I was unsure how effective it could really be. And then I spoke to Patrick, and I do not exaggerate when I say that the conversation has changed my life. I'm sleeping better, training more effectively, and feeling more energetic since I began implementing some of his techniques, and I think there's more to come. But instead of listening to me talk about it, let's get to Patrick, who starts out by explaining exactly what the Oxygen Advantage is.
Basically, we look at it from two perspectives, and we're looking at breathing in sports and exercise performance from two perspectives. Now, when most people hear about breathing, sometimes their eyes gloss over. You know, it's take a big breath or fill your lungs full of air, or, you know, it's what's typically is often taught. But I don't think people realize the potential of what we can do with the breath. And in terms of within 3 to 4 minutes, if you slow down your breathing to create air hunger, your body temperature will increase. Within the same amount of time, if you hold your breath, you can open up your nose and you'll actually feel that your nose decongests. You can also open up your airways in the lungs, the lower airways. And there's a huge connection between your breathing and the mind, your breathing and sleep, and your breathing and sports performance. And this potential has seldom been tapped into, and it hasn't been tapped into in a wide application. So the first branch that I would look at is addressing functional breathing in athletes and also functional breathing in normal individuals. Because really what we need to be doing is we need to have light breathing through the nose, driven by the diaphragm in a regular manner. And that will improve oxygen uptake in the blood by between 5 and 15%. When we have diaphragmatic breathing, we also have stabilization of the spine, and we have improved functional movement. So an interesting paper that was published in October of last year, 2017, in the Journal of International Sports Physical Therapy, they looked at the relationship between functional breathing and functional movement. So for good motor control, for good movement, you need to have good breathing. And those individuals with poor breathing patterns, and they were more likely to score less on the functional movement screen, which would be regarded as, you know, a screen for assessing or helping to determine the risk of injury in individuals who do physical exercise. So really it's about functional breathing is one aspect of it. And then we use special breath hold exercises whereby we do breath holding on the exhalation. And usually we wear little pulse oximeters to measure blood oxygen saturation. So we can simulate an altitude of about between 4 and 5,000 meters. So it's about halfway up Mount Everest. And we can do that without having to leave, you know, sea level. That in turn will force the body to make some adaptations, including increased buffering capacity inside in the muscle compartment. So if I was to say it in a nutshell, what can you do through the breath? Well, you can improve oxygen uptake. You can also improve oxygen delivery to the cells. You can help open up your airways, and you can help improve your sleep. You can, you know, in terms of the mind, there's a huge link between the emotions, diaphragm, slow breathing, fast breathing, and mental concentration, etc. And then another aspect, we can improve respiratory muscle strength. We can improve spine stabilization, and we can also disturb the blood acid base balance to get the body to make adaptations. So I think there's one simple technique with 10 or 11 exercises, and we can gain quite good benefits from it.
That's one of the better opening sales pitches I've heard, for sure.
Well, I hope it's not a sales pitch.
No, but you know what I mean. I mean, that's an extraordinary list of effects.
Sure. Now, I had a psychometric analysis done about 3 weeks ago in Slovenia, and I was doing well in everything except sales. So that's the best compliment I've received so far, Charlie.
Oh, that Irish charm. I bet you could sell coal to miners. Before we get into the scientific side of things, how did you come to discover this? What's your academic area of expertise?
My academic area is completely different. I've a degree in economics and social sciences from a university in Dublin called Trinity College, and I was in the corporate world. But I had asthma all the way through my childhood, into my teenage years, and into my early 20s. And I was exhausted all the time, and I had really poor concentration. I did get my grades, but I had to study hard to get them. You know, it's really, I suppose I was a child of the 1970s, so I was attending doctors from 1980 right up to about 1997, 1998. So, there's 18 years there. And all that time, I was breathing chronically through an open mouth. I was sleeping with my mouth open. When I stayed in Uppsala University in Sweden during Erasmus, I was told that I was stopping breathing during my sleep. Of course, I had no idea what was going on. I later learned that condition is called obstructive sleep apnea. So an individual with poor breathing pattern, it's not just that the nose is stuffy, and it wasn't just that my airways were feeling tight all the time. My sleep was adversely affected, my concentration, my ability to handle stress, and all that tied in. So I was in the corporate world, and I was reading an article in the newspaper, and just the article kind of caught my attention. It was about asthma, and it was about the work of a Russian doctor, and he said the importance of breathing through your nose and to breathe lightly. And that was news to me because I had never heard of that information before. I even went as far as having an operation on my nose in 1994, but I never switched to nasal breathing. I wasn't told the importance of nasal breathing, and there was no rehabilitation afterwards. So even despite the operation, I still continued breathing through an open mouth. And I think it's bizarre in many ways. I found it by accident. I started putting it into practice. And within a few days, I was noticing my sleep was improving. And this is not news. This is all well documented, and it's well known in the literature. And a lot of my talks now are at international sleep congresses. I've just come back from Rome there about 3 weeks ago. And I spoke at the AAMS Sleep Congress. And basically it was attended by some of the top sleep doctors in the world, including who would be considered the founding father of sleep medicine, Stanford medicine-based doctor called Dr. Christian Guilleminault. And he discovered obstructive sleep apnea back in the 1970s. And he's writing about the importance of nasal breathing for sleep in pediatrics, but the same will apply to adults. So we don't know the amount of people who are sleeping with an open mouth, but we do know that individuals over 40 years of age are 6 times more likely to sleep with an open mouth. And it's not that they'll have their mouth open, it's not that they'll be breathing through their mouth for 100% of the time. No, that doesn't necessarily happen, but what happens is that you switch from nose to mouth breathing to nose to mouth breathing. You wake up with a dry mouth and you wake up tired. So I'd say to anybody, any of your listeners, if they have a dry mouth in the morning, it's really absolutely vital that you start addressing breathing patterns, breathing through the nose, breathing lightly. And the nose is a wonderful organ. Once you start using it, it stays open for you.
Is that sleep apnea? Is that the same thing you get at high altitudes where you wake up and you suddenly haven't got any breath inside you?
Yes, it is. I'm not sure why it would be happening at high altitude. Blood oxygen saturation is already desaturated.
Well, I used to work in the Himalayas, and it's I think it's called Cheney-Stokes syndrome.
Yes, it is.
And you kind of wake up and it's like you haven't breathed for a minute and you just can't get the air in. Is that what you were suffering with? Sleep
apnea would be happening during nighttime, and basically is when there is a cessation to breathing. Okay. So say, for instance, you have an individual and they're snoring, and then they breathe in through their nose and they breathe out, or they breathe in through their mouth and breathe out through their mouth, and then they stop breathing. And they stop breathing for a period of time, and it can be enough to drop the blood oxygen saturation very, very significantly. Now, they will resume breathing with gasping, and they'll often find that their heart is racing. So it's a very stressful condition in terms that it's activating a sympathetic response in the body. It drives up blood pressure, puts pressure on the heart. It's linked with a number of different conditions. But also your breathing and how you breathe will significantly influence it. And what's more, the typical treatment, the gold standard of treatment is to wear a CPAP machine, and 50% of people will give it up after about 3 to 6 months. So here you have a condition, and 50% of people are abandoning treatment because they're not able to comply with it. And also, it's estimated up to 90% of people are undiagnosed. So they're having it. It's responsible for 20% of road traffic accidents. Of course, it's going to have a detrimental effect on fatigue, etc., and concentration. And it just doesn't apply to adults. It applies to children just as much, and then their academic ability is affected, and sleep and open mouth breathing and ADD.
So, okay, how do you breathe through your nose when sleeping? And what will the most noticeable effect be? A more restful sleep? I don't know the technical terms for categories of sleep.
Yes, well, you have a deeper sleep. Stanford is currently doing some research at the moment. They have a couple of individuals and they're blocking their noses. So they basically have nose plugs on, and it's forcing them to breathe through an open mouth both during the day and during sleep. So it's forcing them to breathe through an open mouth for 10 days. And, I was in touch with the researchers and I said, listen, I kind of guess what the results here are going to be. Sleep is going to be the big thing that's going to be affected, but also stress. And the reason being is that what do we do? Just answering your question in terms of sleep, we use paper tape across the lips, and we've been doing so for about 20 years. And I know it sounds totally bizarre, a piece of paper tape across the lips in order to keep the lips together to breathe through the nose. But it's amazing when you breathe through your nose, your breathing will tend to be deeper, you're more likely to use your diaphragm, and your breathing will be more regular. And there's a better oxygen uptake, as I said earlier. But also your diaphragm muscle is directly linked with your upper airway dilator muscles. And during wakefulness, when we're sitting here, our upper airways, which would be the airways, say the muscles in the throat, they're designed to keep the airway open, and they do a good job during the day, but during sleep, they get lazy. And as they get lazy, the airway collapses. So we really need to get the diaphragm working in order to, tap into the connection between the diaphragm and the upper airway dilator muscles, so that the individual is less likely to be stopping breathing during sleep, or even simple snoring, mouth snoring. Once you tape up, you stop snoring through your mouth because you're breathing through your nose. Now, you can't snore through your nose, but that too will significantly reduce the more you change your breathing patterns. The main thing about the nose was in 1988, there were researchers, Swift, and basically they had patients post-jaw surgery, and the patients had their jaws wired shut, so they were forced to breathe through their noses. And they noticed that their oxygen uptake in the blood increased by 10%. Now, if you look at the work of, say, ENT Dr. James Bartley from New Zealand, and he writes quite prolific about the importance of nose breathing, also in the medical textbooks. I've got one chapter of a textbook that he has written, and it's devoted exclusively to the importance of breathing through the nose and the functions of nasal breathing. Nasal breathing also results in a higher end-tidal CO2, or a higher carbon dioxide in the blood. And the biggest mistake that people make when they think about breathing is they think that the more air you breathe into your lungs, the more it improves or increases oxygen uptake in the blood. And that's not necessarily true, because 98% of your oxygen in the blood is carried by hemoglobin molecules. And under normal conditions, your blood oxygen saturation is already 95 to 99%. So you're already almost fully saturated with normal light breathing. And if you breathe harder, you're not going to add any more oxygen. You're not going to improve your saturation, your blood oxygen saturation anymore. But what hard breathing does is it will get rid of the gas carbon dioxide. So you get rid of it from the lungs and also from the blood. And with a reduction of CO2 in the blood, what happens is that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen increases. In other words, in order for the red blood cells to release oxygen to the cells, you need carbon dioxide. But if you're breathing hard and you're getting rid of too much CO2, the bond between hemoglobin and oxygen increases. And that's known as the Bohr effect. It was discovered back in 1904. And it's related to blood pH. But basically, the individual, if they're breathing hard, going around with their mouth open, taking big breaths in and out through their mouth, they get rid of carbon dioxide, and that causes an increase to blood pH, and the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen increases. In other words, the red blood cells hold on to oxygen when there's a loss of CO2 rather than release it. So we do the opposite, Charlie. We get people to soften their breathing. And if any of your listeners wanted to try it, you could, if you're sitting up straight, and hopefully you're not driving your car. But basically, if you're sitting up straight, just put one hand on your chest and one hand just above your navel, and tune into your breathing pattern. So feel the slightly colder air as it comes into your nose, and feel the slightly warmer air as it leaves your nose. And as you feel your breathing, gently start slowing down the speed of air as it enters and leaves your nostrils. So gently start quietening your breathing. So soften the breath to the point that you feel hardly any air coming into your nose. And the objective is that you feel air hunger. Maintain that feeling of air hunger for about 3 to 5 minutes. Now, it shouldn't be stressful, but at the start you might feel it kind of feels a little bit different because you're feeling breathless, even though you're just sitting down. So what are we doing? Well, what we're doing is we're deliberately softening and slowing down the breath, and we are reducing the amount of air that we're taking into the lungs. That in turn will cause an increase of the gas carbon dioxide in the blood. And it's the increase of carbon dioxide in the blood that creates the feeling of air hunger. But when we have an increase of CO2 in the blood, our blood vessels dilate, they open up. And also, there's an increased oxygen delivery from the blood to the cells. So ironically, when we slow down our breathing and when we feel that we're not getting enough air, our blood circulation will increase or improve, and oxygen delivery will increase. And another thing is that people will feel, generally they'll notice that there's increased watery saliva in the mouth. So we're doing slow breathing to activate the body's parasympathetic response and also to improve blood circulation. Now, back to when I was talking about the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy, they looked at breathing from a number of pillars, and the pillars are biochemistry, in other words, what is the carbon dioxide in the blood, biomechanics, in other words, are you using your chest or are you using your diaphragm to breathe, and psychophysiological aspects, and that would be using a questionnaire called Nijmegen. And they found that one of the easiest ways and straightforward ways to measure breathing pattern disorders was to have a normal breath into your nose, a normal breath out through your nose, and pinch your nose, and time it in seconds until you feel the first definite desire to breathe. And basically, the cutoff was 25 seconds. So you're not holding your breath for as long as possible. You're only holding your breath until you feel the first definite desire to breathe. But if your score is less than 25 seconds, you've got an 89% chance of breathing pattern disorders. And if your score is above 25 seconds, you've got an 89% chance that you don't have breathing pattern disorders. So I think it's a very interesting one that anybody can try. So typically, when I was going in my early 20s, my breath hold time would have been about 10 seconds. I was constantly experiencing brain fog, fatigue, cold hands, cold feet because of impaired circulation. So we're saying as well, if you're doing physical exercise won't improve your breathing patterns. But if you've got a low BOLT score, and that's what we use it in the book, breath hold time basically. So if your breath hold time is low, you're going to experience disproportionate breathlessness during physical exercise. So really what we want to do is we want to improve functional breathing patterns, that when the individual is doing any sort of physical exercise, that they are not gassing out too soon. Because your degree of breathlessness during physical exercise is primarily influenced by how you breathe during rest, and your BOLT score will give you good feedback of that.
Okay, so because you as someone that only started learning about this when a friend recommended you and I started reading up on you, before I read any of your literature, I'd always assumed that the best way to get more oxygen in was to breathe more and to breathe harder. And
Yes.
What you're saying is that's actually could we say counterproductive?
Yeah, it's not it's not the ideal thing to do. You know, we've all been told this information, and I remember reading a book called Calm by an author called Paul Wilson. This is going back in my third year, and I was pretty anxious anyway, going in to do the exam. So I took a walk and I started taking these huge, big breaths in the belief that I was going to bring more oxygen to the brain. And I went into my exams lightheaded. And, you know, now, of course, it makes total sense to me why that happened, but it didn't back then. But I couldn't concentrate because what I had done was, in the belief of taking the huge, big breaths, I actually deprived my brain of oxygen. And I can give you some statistics on it. It takes 30 seconds of hard breathing to lower the amount of CO2 in the blood by half. 30 seconds. Now, that was published back in 1983. It's going back a little while. And Megarian, in a paper called Hyperventilation, a diagnosis begging for recognition, he said every 1 millimeter drop of CO2 reduces blood flow to the brain by 2%. Now, if you can halve the amount of blood flow, if you can halve the amount of CO2 in the blood within 30 seconds of hard breathing, that basically means that you're bringing your CO2 levels from 40 millimeter of mercury pressure down to 20. And every 1 millimeter drop reduces blood flow to the brain by 2%. It means that 30 seconds of hard breathing will reduce blood flow to the brain by 40%. Now, that's huge, you know, and if we think of it this way, when we get stressed, we often find it difficult to think straight. And it is a normal physiological response during stress to breathe harder. We breathe faster, we breathe more using our upper chest. But that was fine throughout our evolution because anytime we were stressed, we had to do intense physical exercise. It was the fight or flight response. But nowadays we're under stress, but we're sitting down. It's not accompanied by physical exercise. So we're under stress, we're breathing hard, and we're depriving our brain of oxygen. And the very time that we need lots of oxygen going to the brain in order to you know, make decisions with clarity, we don't, because the stress response is increasing our breathing. So I'd say to anybody, if you're experiencing stress, really slow down the breath and even do some small breath holding. We use it a lot with people with panic attacks. I have for about 20 years. And if you think the traditional way to help somebody with a panic attack was traditionally they were handed a brown paper bag. Now that makes more sense than taking big breaths because the brown paper bag would be pooling carbon dioxide to rebreathe it back into the lungs, to increase it in the blood in order to improve blood flow to the brain. And that would have a calming effect. But we don't use a brown paper bag. It's not altogether safe if you're doing it long term because your blood oxygen saturation can drop. But we do small breath holds. So one of the exercises in the Oxygen Advantage is breathing recovery. So you take a small breath in through your nose, a small breath out through your nose. You pinch your nose and you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then let go. Breathe in through your nose and just breathe normal for about 10 seconds. And after 10 seconds is to repeat it again. So you take a normal breath in, normal breath out through your nose, pinch your nose and hold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let go and then breathe in through your nose. And you continue that. And it's quite useful exercise, small little exercise when you're feeling stressed.
So for people that are engaged in exercise, so if you're
Yes.
playing rugby, you have to sprint.
Yeah. Yes.
But you need your brain to function.
Yes.
What can people do where it's unavoidable that your heart rate's going to go up?
Well, you know, Woorens is a French researcher, and he wrote a paper. He was the author of a paper published just this year, and it was looking at repeated sprintability in rugby players, and they were elite rugby union. And basically, pre-test, there was both the experimental group and the control group. They were able to achieve 9 repeated sprintabilities. So 9 sprints, 40-meter sprints with very little recovery. I think it was about 30 seconds between each. And they had 9 until exhaustion, or they achieved, I think it was 85% of their maximum capacity. They did a trial over eight weeks, and they replaced some of the high-intensity interval training with breath holding. And it's the same exercise that we have in the Oxygen Advantage. Breathe in through your nose, breathe out through your nose, pinch your nose, and sprint for 40 meters holding your breath. And then release your nose, you recover your breathing while walking, and repeat that again, and it's a rest of 30 seconds between each. But within 8 weeks, repeated sprintability increased from 9 to 14. Now, the control group had no change, and the control group were doing their normal training and high-intensity interval training. So here's a case whereby 2 sessions of high-intensity interval training were dropped in the experimental group and replaced with 2 sets of breath holding. I think there was 7 breath holds per set. That repeated sprintability in the elite rugby players, and usually these guys, it's difficult enough, if you get a 1 or 2% gain there, you'd be happy enough with that. But here it increased from 9 to 14 in 2 months. And this is the potential, because what's happening there? Well, basically, when you do a strong breath hold, you're lowering your blood oxygen saturation, but at the same time, you're increasing CO2 in the blood. And you've got an increased hydrogen ion because of the hypoxic response, but you've also an increased hydrogen ion because of the high carbon dioxide. So we're really disturbing blood acid base balance. And what this is doing then is increasing the buffering capacity inside in the muscle. So if you've got an increased buffering capacity in the muscle, what happens is that the phosphates and the proteins in the muscle, they're able to bind with hydrogen ion so that they can delay the onset of lactic acid and fatigue. And again, these are just simple exercises that they can be having very powerful gains. So back to your question, yeah, one needs to sprint, but how hard do you breathe during your sprint? What we're saying is that you can achieve more with the same amount of effort. And it's not that we don't all breathe the same. If you're running or you're going for a walk or, you're going for a jog, say with a colleague, and you're checking your breathing against your colleagues, well, one of you may be breathing harder. So hard breathing is inefficient breathing because there is an energy cost associated with breathing, but also breathlessness often sets the limits of exertion. That feeling of intense breathlessness, that's what's setting the limits. And athletes train, they look at, many different functions, but they're not looking at breathing. But yet it's breathing that could offer the most potential.
So you're not saying to people when you exercise or when you train, here's this magic bullet, breathe like this, do this. You're talking about introducing this into your program and creating a physiological change in the athlete.
Yes, totally. All I'm doing is looking at any of the stuff that I say. You can verify it in terms of Google the Bohr effect and learn how oxygen is released from the red blood cells in the presence of CO2. Look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, and that would also be based on the Bohr effect. Look at the functions of carbon dioxide in the body. Look at the science that we've put up on the website in terms of papers that are looking at the exhale hold technique. And there's 10 years of research there. But we've also 20 papers on asthma, and I've been involved directly with 4 of them. I had 2 papers. I was the co-author that was published in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine in May of last year. And basically that looked at mouth-breathing children with asthma. And it improved. I can't remember the length of time. It might have been 4 weeks. It could have been 8 weeks. But basically it improved the lung function parameters in the children with asthma. It reduced their school absenteeism, but it also improved their sleep. Now, how many people have exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, regardless of whether they're prone to asthma or not? And nasal breathing is really important there. And yes, if I'm working with a recreational athlete, I'll try and get them to breathe through their nose for the vast majority of the time. The quality of the breath is different through the nose. If you're breathing through the mouth, there's very little resistance to your breathing. So you'll tend to breathe faster, but more shallow. But if you were to look at the structure of the human lungs, the greatest concentration of blood in the human lungs are in the lower lobes of the lungs. So what we want to do is by breathing through the nose, you're taking the air deeper into the lungs, so a better gas exchange can take place. So the quality of the breath when you're running, it will be a slower breath. You won't be having as many breaths per minute, but you will be having deeper and bigger breaths. You will have more regular breathing through your nose, but you'll also have a better recovery after physical exercise. Now, if I'm working with a competitive athlete, if they're elite athletes, for example, we'll do an 80-20 rule. We'll do 80% of the training with the mouth closed. This adds an extra load onto the athlete, but we'll also do 20% with their mouth open so they can achieve their maximum intensity. But we'll replace some of their high intensity interval training, which can cause a risk of injury. You know, it can be traumatic for an athlete to train at an intensity in order to stimulate anaerobic glycolysis. But we can do it with simple breath holding during a jog. Or if you have an athlete who's injured that they can't train maximum capacity, again, we'll disturb the blood acid base balance, creating a hypoxic response by simply getting the athlete to breathe in through the nose, out through the nose, pinch the nose and walk, and then fast walk, and then go into a jog. And then when the air hunger is pretty strong, let go and breathe in through the nose. And then we have them do minimal breathing for 6 breaths. And that will drop the blood oxygen saturation. You can witness it, you know, it's easy to witness it with a pulse oximeter. So we do intermittent hypoxic training to stimulate anaerobic glycolysis, but no risk of injury, no risk of trauma to the athlete.
Okay, I've got so many questions, I don't know where to start.
Right.
First thing that strikes me is, why is this not a widely accepted part of sports science?
I don't know. I think it's new. There was an article that was published back in 2010, and you'll get the article. I can send it on to you. But the article is titled "Apnea: A New Training Method in Sport." Now, there were coaches using apnea training throughout the 80s, but they were breathing in and holding. So they would have, say, Councilman was quite a well-known swimming coach in the United States. He was having his athletes taking a breath in and holding their breath. And, you know, he was thinking that it was causing a hypoxic response, but it wasn't. If you breathe in and hold, you can drop the blood oxygen saturation, but it's more difficult to do. We can get pretty much any athlete to create a hypoxic response within 3 to 4 days of training. I personally think that it's just people don't know about it. You know, there is a growing amount of research coming out. Even if you look at the research that was coming from Mid-Sweden University back the last 15, 20 years, if you do breath holding, your spleen, which is your blood bank, that contracts to release increased red blood cells into circulation. And that effect lasts for about 10 minutes. And another thing, if you do breath holding, your kidneys become hypoxic and they release a hormone called erythropoietin, or EPO. And EPO is sending a message to the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. So an athlete who was, say, preparing for a race, you'd want to be doing breath holding, because up to about the last 2 to 3 days of the event, because it takes about 3 to 4 days for the increased erythropoietin to mature red blood cells. So already I was talking about improving anaerobic capacity, but there's also a lot of papers looking at aerobic capacity. And then we look at respiratory muscle strength. You know, if you're breathing through your nose, you're going to have improved diaphragmatic breathing. Your nose imposes a resistance to your breathing that's twice that of the mouth. So you'll have a stronger diaphragm. And if you do your physical exercise while breathing through your nose, and also by doing breath holding, we can improve respiratory muscle strength. Now, the diaphragm is prone to fatigue in quite a number of athletes, and from the top of my head, I believe it's 50% of athletes. And what happens is that if the diaphragm fatigues, blood is stolen from the diaphragm. Blood is stolen from the legs to feed the diaphragm. So the legs will go jelly, and the athlete won't be able to maintain their speed. Now, Alison McConnell has been writing about this for years. She produced a device to power breathe. Do you need to have a device to improve respiratory muscle strength? No. That's what we've been teaching for 20 years, using the same technique. You know, so I think the information is out there, but I came across it too. I've been working in this field for health and with asthma and sleep apnea and anxiety for 10 years. And then I had a physiologist to come over from, I think it was Sweden, and we were discussing the application of this in sports. And that's when I started sitting down. I spent 3 to 4 years just joining dots together and putting it together. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized this information is all there, but it hadn't been collected.
I think it feels to me as if people are beginning to understand the importance of sleep. A strength coach said to me, if you can sleep 1 more hour a night, it's like taking steroids for your
Yeah,
performance. I mean, what?
I I would agree with him, and I wouldn't agree with him, because you could be sleeping 1 more hour with your mouth open, and that won't be like a steroid effect. The athlete will be even more groggy. Um, there's quality and there's quantity of sleep. And Nick Littlehale is probably the most well-known sleep coach out there. He was taken by Alex Ferguson initially. He was brought into to Manchester United, and of course the running joke was that his job was to tuck in the athletes, tuck them into bed before they went to sleep. But he was brought in for a reason, and that was to improve their sleep. And if you look, he's got a book called Sleep, and he's also included the importance of nose breathing. You can't have a good night's sleep unless you breathe through your nose. And I've no idea the amount of athletes or the amount of normal people, because this never gets studied. It never gets studied, the instance of mouth breathing during sleep. Bar that last study that I quoted, you're 6 times more likely to mouth breathe if you're over 40 years of age. But other than that, we've very little information on it. But all we know is that it's happening. I've had about 7,000 people in through my doors over the last 17 or 18 years. And I asked, how many of you here are waking up with a dry mouth in the morning? And I would say it's about 50%. So 50% of people, it's a high statistic that, these individuals, their sleep quality could be addressed.
And beyond sleep, it might sound a bit of a strange question because we all know we need oxygen, but how does increased oxygen, when you're not exercising, you're just going about your everyday life, a higher saturation of oxygen affect your day-to-day life?
See, it doesn't. If you think about it this way, we would have people coming in with chronic fatigue, and these individuals, their resilience is pretty much depleted. Not totally, but they have reduced resilience. They've got reduced exercise capacity. They might go out for a walk for 20 minutes, and they'll have so much lactic acid that they'll have to go back to bed with muscle soreness or whatever for a couple of hours. The issue isn't the amount of oxygen in the blood. The issue is, how do we get the oxygen from the blood to the cells? And for that, you need carbon dioxide. But it's like, there was a paper published, researchers in Sweden were looking at long-term absenteeism because it was causing a large economic cost in Sweden, and basically stress in the corporate world causing exhaustion. They looked at the breathing patterns. Now, this was the only time that this study that I've ever been aware of it was a 2014 paper. They looked at the breathing patterns of individuals with chronic exhaustion, and they found that 100% of them were overbreathers. So here's a case, and I think this is normal when we tease into it a little bit more. Stress makes us breathe hard. Stress makes us breathe faster. We sigh more. We're breathing more using our upper chest. But if we're in long-term stress, we develop, that breathing pattern becomes habitual. So that becomes our normal breathing pattern. So even when the stress is removed, we continue to breathe like that. And here's the individuals then suffering from long-term exhaustion. They're suffering from long-term exhaustion, but their breathing patterns have remained high. And in the paper itself, they brought in grounding techniques to help address hyperventilation. And they found that all of their symptoms, anxiety and depression scores reduced simply by getting these people to breathe less. And it's not that we're getting them to breathe less than what they should be. All we're trying to do is change their breathing patterns towards functional, so that they're breathing a more normal volume of air. Because when your breathing volume is normal, your carbon dioxide levels in the blood are normal, and it's carbon dioxide that is the catalyst for the release of oxygen from the red blood cells to the cells. So we can measure anybody's SpO2 with pulse oximetry, and the vast majority of people are normal, but that's not the question. The real question is, how do we get it out of the blood? How do we get the oxygen out of the blood and get it delivered to the cells? What I'm saying is probably contrary, Charlie, to what most people, and even what's going on in yoga, in a lot of yoga studios, Pilates, stress counselors, where anybody who's telling, if we have an instructor, or if there's an instructor telling somebody to fill your lungs full of air, take big breaths, you know, I don't know if it's the ideal thing to be doing. Now, I suppose some of your listeners then will be wondering, well, what about Wim Hof? I don't know if you're aware of the Wim Hof technique, but basically it involves 30 seconds or 30 big breaths followed by by breath holding. And we would have similarities. We're doing breath holding, but we don't do the hyperventilation. But the reason that they do the hyperventilation is a stress to the body. And if you force the body into a little bit of a stress, the body will make adaptations. So there can be uses for it, but I would be more, questioning who are the individuals that would be most suited to these exercises, because there's people who can handle stress and physiological stress, but then again, there's people we shouldn't put them under all that much physiological stress because we could put them overboard. So I think people with good resilience, they can cope with hyperventilation and breath holding. People with a Bolt score of above 25 seconds, but those individuals with a Bolt score of less than 25 seconds, I wouldn't have them do hyperventilation. I just have them do gentle, easy enough exercises with some breath holding, but doing it within their limits.
Okay, well, when I hang up here, I'm looking forward to trying the exercises you've already listed, and I don't want to make what is clearly... Sorry?
And check how your body is reacting. But I'd be happy to send you exercises. You put them into practice, check your body temperature. And like I was giving it, and I was thinking the same. Like I said, I'm going to get crucified out here. I'm going into a live audience. And not only that, of course, it was in Ireland, so they had to do it in a pub. So people were drinking alcohol. So I said, like, how am I going to get this information across? So I had people practice it. And I asked in the audience a simple question. After 3 minutes of slowing down the breath to create air hunger, I said, do you feel colder, warmer, or the same? And majority of people came back with warmer. Do you have increased saliva, no change in saliva in your mouth, or is your mouth drier? Most people came back with increased watery saliva. Well, all I wanted to do was to show cause and effect. You slow down your breathing, your blood circulation improves, and you also activate the parasympathetic response of the body. And then with the second exercise, I had them decongest their nose. So if any of your listeners have a congested nose, even if it's a head cold, take a normal breath in through your nose, a normal breath out through your nose, pinch your nose, hold your nose, and walk around while holding your breath, and continue holding your breath until you feel a medium to strong air hunger, and then let go and breathe in through your nose. And do that about 5 times, your nose will open up. Now, the only thing I'll say is if the female is pregnant or if you've got a high blood pressure or serious health conditions, don't do a strong breath hold. Avoid that one. But you could do a gentle breathe light exercise.
Okay, so I know you've got to go. I don't want to make complicated science simple, but if someone's listening to this and they think, I'm going to look more into this, what would be you've already listed a couple, and feel free to say it's one of the ones you've already listed, but what would be a couple of things that people could do almost sitting wherever they're listening to this to understand the power of it? Would it be the 3-minute holds?
You could. I think the best one would be to do slow breathing to create air hunger, so that you're tuning into the breath and you're really slowing down the speed of your breathing, and almost to breathe almost as if you're hardly breathing at all. Now, if the person is prone to anxiety or panic, it might just bring a little bit, the feeling of suffocation could bring up a small little bit of panic. So what I'd say to that individual is to go easy. But if you're not prone to anxiety or panic, yes, slow down your breathing. Feel the air hunger. There's no difference between what you would experience if you're going for a light jog. And just check what exactly is happening in the body. It's amazing when we can tap into it. Like if you think, we have 100,000 miles of blood vessels in the human body. We can influence that through our breath. And what's more, it's by doing the opposite to what's commonly being taught. Now, is it true to take a deep breath? Yes. But what is a deep breath? A deep breath just means that we're using our diaphragm. And for the mind, breathing through the nose and breathing lightly and using the diaphragm is very important for emotional stability. Stanford researchers in March of last year, if you were to Google slow breathing and Stanford, they identified a new structure in the brain in the locus coeruleus, and they said that this structure in the brain is spying on your breathing. If you're breathing fast, you're more likely to be agitated. And if you're breathing slow, you're more likely to be calm. But what we're saying is that your everyday breathing should be slow all the time. And that's only through the nose. Whereas I was a mouth breather, fast breathing, upper chest breathing, and I was in a constant state of stress. And we know that up to 50% of studied children are breathing through an open mouth. And very few healthcare professionals are saying anything to these kids. It's not happening in schools that we're aware of. The mothers and fathers aren't aware of it. And healthcare professionals, even though it's well documented in the literature, there's nothing to be lost from teaching somebody to breathe through the nose. There's no side effects. There's no cost. There's no product to be sold. And this could be one reason why it hasn't, achieved commercialization, because you can't trademark it, you can't patent it, you can't do a whole lot of things with it. And unfortunately, sometimes our healthcare system is very much evolved around a market and around profit, but breathing and light breathing has been around with us for 2,500 years. I think it's back to basics.
Patrick, that is absolutely one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever done, and I'm slightly disappointed we didn't start earlier, because now I know you've got to go, but I really appreciate your time. And if people would like to know a bit more about you and delve more into this, presumably your website is the first port of call.
Sure, we have. I've put up quite a few videos as well up on YouTube. So under our Oxygen Advantage channel, and the science, I'm kind of drawing it onto a whiteboard so people can see the science there. I'm sure some of the exercises are there as well. I can't remember what's there, but the science then, in terms of the papers that we were talking about, the science and papers is oxygenadvantage.com.
Thank you to Patrick for his time and for helping me, and I suspect many of you guys in the next few weeks, sleep and feel better. To find out more, which I would very strongly recommend, check out oxygenadvantage.com. We'll be back again soon with a very special guest who you need to be keeping an eye on with the Tokyo Olympics in 2020 looming. As ever, thank you for listening, and please do help us out by rating us on iTunes, subscribing, and telling your friends to tune in. Speak soon.